The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, thin and ordinary, the kind of envelope you almost toss aside without thinking. But the moment I saw the HOA logo stamped in the corner, something in my gut tightened. I stood there in my kitchen, coffee cooling in my hand, rereading my own address as if it belonged to someone else. When I opened it, I expected a warning, maybe a complaint about trash bins or lawn height. Instead, my eyes locked onto a number that made my heart stop. $5,000. In HOA fines. Due immediately. I read the page again, slower this time, hoping I had misunderstood. According to the letter, I had violated multiple community regulations over the past year. Unauthorized property use. Structural changes without approval. Repeated non-compliance. The language was cold, formal, and final. At the bottom, a single sentence warned that failure to pay could result in liens, legal action, or foreclosure proceedings. My hands started to shake. I had lived in this neighborhood for years without a single issue. I attended meetings. I paid dues on time. I followed the rules, even when they felt petty. So how could I suddenly owe $5,000 for violations I didn't recognize? I sat down at the table and spread the papers out like evidence in a trial, scanning dates and descriptions that felt deliberately vague. No photos. No warnings. Just accusations and a demand. Anger came next, sharp and hot. I called the HOA office immediately, only to be sent to voicemail. I left a message, calm but firm, asking for clarification. An hour passed. Then two. When the phone finally rang, the woman on the other end sounded bored, as if this conversation was routine. She told me the fines were approved unanimously by the board and were non-negotiable. When I asked for proof, she suggested I review the bylaws and ended the call. That night, I barely slept. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Could they really take my home over this? The more I thought about it, the more wrong it felt. Something didn't add up. These fines weren't just excessive, they were aggressive, almost calculated. And as I stared at the letter again under the kitchen light, I realized this wasn't a mistake. It was a move. And I had a feeling it was about to backfire spectacularly. By the next morning, fear had hardened into determination. If the HOA thought I would quietly write a check and move on, they had seriously misjudged me. I cleared my schedule, sat at my desk, and pulled out every document I'd ever received from the association. Bylaws. Amendments. Meeting notices. Old emails. I stacked them neatly, like armor before a battle. The violations listed in the letter were frustratingly vague, but one phrase kept appearing: unauthorized use of shared property. That line didn't make sense. I hadn't touched any shared property. I barely interacted with it beyond walking my dog and parking in my own driveway. Still, I highlighted it and kept reading. Another alleged violation referenced structural alterations affecting community appearance. That one made my jaw tighten. The only change I'd made in years was replacing a broken fence panel with one identical to the original. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting. When I arrived, the room felt colder than usual, filled with polite smiles that didn't reach anyone's eyes. When my turn came to speak, I calmly asked for clarification on the fines. The board president leaned back in her chair and told me the matter was already decided. When I asked how $5,000 had been calculated, she said it was based on accumulated penalties. No breakdown. No explanation. I left that meeting furious, but also suspicious. Accumulated penalties only worked if violations were documented over time. I had never received a single warning. Not a letter. Not an email. Not even a knock on the door. That realization shifted something in my mind. This wasn't sloppy management. This was intentional. That night, I started digging deeper. I requested HOA records formally, citing my right as a homeowner. Days passed before they responded, and when they did, the documents felt incomplete. Pages were missing. Dates didn't line up. Worse, I noticed several fines were dated during months I had been out of town, confirmed by flight receipts and hotel bookings still saved on my phone. Then I found something that made my heart pound. A recent board meeting summary mentioned selective enforcement of rules to maintain community standards. That phrase was buried in neutral language, but I knew what it meant. They were choosing who to target. And somehow, I was on that list. As I leaned back in my chair, documents spread around me, one truth became clear. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were testing limits. And if I didn't push back now, this wouldn't end with a fine. It would end with my home. Once I realized I wasn't the only one being targeted, everything changed. I started talking to neighbors, casually at first, then more deliberately. At barbecues, during evening walks, while checking the mail. I asked simple questions about HOA notices and fines, careful not to sound alarmed. What I discovered unsettled me. One neighbor admitted she'd been fined for leaving her garage door open too long. Another was charged hundreds for a mailbox that supposedly didn't match community standards, even though it had been there since the neighborhood was built. Most disturbing were the stories that never made it onto paper. Verbal warnings. Threats of future consequences. Suggestions that it would be easier to just pay and move on. A pattern began to form. Every homeowner with a recent fine shared one thing in common. They had questioned the board at some point. Some had challenged fee increases. Others had asked for transparency in budgets. I remembered the meeting where I'd raised concerns about a sudden jump in landscaping costs. At the time, it felt minor. Now, it felt like a trigger. I requested the HOA's financial statements next. When they arrived, I spread them across my dining table and examined them line by line. The numbers didn't scream fraud, but they whispered misdirection. Fines had become a major source of revenue, increasing sharply over the last year. Meanwhile, maintenance expenses stayed roughly the same. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were funding themselves through punishment. When I confronted the board president privately, she smiled politely and told me the fines were meant to encourage compliance. I asked why compliance suddenly required thousands of dollars. Her smile tightened. She reminded me that homeowners agreed to the bylaws when they bought their homes. Then she warned me, gently, that pushing too hard could make things uncomfortable. That was the moment fear tried to creep back in. The idea that a small group of people could legally pressure homeowners into silence was terrifying. But fear didn't win. Anger did. Because now I knew this wasn't personal anymore. It was systemic. I contacted a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. He listened quietly as I explained everything, then asked a question that stopped me cold. Have they provided photographic evidence of these violations? When I said no, he nodded slowly. He told me selective enforcement was not only unethical, but potentially illegal. As I walked out of his office, sunlight hitting my face, I felt something I hadn't felt since opening that letter. Control. The HOA had made a move, confident I would fold. But they had underestimated one thing. I had proof, allies, and now, a strategy. And the next step would force them into the open. Armed with legal advice and a growing stack of evidence, I stopped playing defense. The attorney helped me draft a formal dispute letter, carefully worded and impossible to ignore. It demanded a full itemized breakdown of every fine, photographic proof of each alleged violation, and copies of all notices supposedly sent to me. We gave them a deadline. 10 business days. The response came faster than expected, which immediately raised suspicion. Instead of documentation, the HOA sent another letter. This one wasn't about clarification. It was about pressure. The tone shifted from bureaucratic to threatening, warning that continued refusal to pay could trigger immediate legal escalation. There was still no proof attached. Just intimidation wrapped in official language. I brought that letter to the next board meeting. The room went silent as I read it aloud. I asked a simple question afterward. Can anyone here point to a single documented warning I received before these fines? No one answered. The treasurer shuffled papers. The president cleared her throat and said documentation was handled administratively. That was the moment several neighbors began murmuring. One homeowner stood up and said he'd received a similar letter months earlier. Another admitted she was fined without ever being contacted. The board tried to regain control, but the energy in the room had shifted. This wasn't a private dispute anymore. It was public. A few days later, I received a digital folder from the HOAS management company. Inside were photos supposedly proving my violations. My stomach dropped when I opened them. The images were generic. No timestamps. No identifiable landmarks. One photo showed a fence that wasn't even mine. Another captured a shared pathway I had never modified. Even worse, metadata revealed the photos were taken after the fines were issued. That discovery felt electric. I forwarded everything to my attorney, who responded with a single sentence. This is extremely problematic for them. He explained that issuing fines before documenting violations was a serious breach of procedure. Backdating evidence made it worse. We filed a formal complaint and requested mediation. The HOA suddenly changed tactics. Emails became polite. Calls went unanswered. The fines were no longer mentioned directly, as if silence could erase them. But I wasn't interested in quiet resolution anymore. Too many people had been affected. Too much had been hidden. I sent a detailed summary of my findings to every homeowner in the community, attaching copies of the letters and photos. Transparency, I learned, is terrifying to people who rely on secrecy. And that's when the real cracks began to show. The response from the community was immediate and explosive. My inbox filled within hours of sending that email. Neighbors shared stories that sounded eerily familiar to mine. Surprise fines. Vague accusations. Threats that arrived without warning. People who had paid out of fear now realized they might never have owed anything at all. By the next morning, the HOA board issued a community-wide notice urging residents to avoid misinformation and to direct concerns only through official channels. That message did the opposite of what they intended. It confirmed everything. If there was nothing to hide, there would be nothing to control. A special board meeting was announced just 2 days later. When I arrived, the room was packed. Homeowners lined the walls, arms crossed, voices low but tense. The board members looked different now. Less confident. Less rehearsed. The president opened with a statement about maintaining order, but she was interrupted almost immediately by questions she couldn't deflect. Someone demanded to know why fines had increased so sharply. Another asked why warnings were skipped entirely. A retired accountant stood up and asked why fine revenue was being used to cover administrative adjustments instead of community improvements. The treasurer stammered. The management company representative avoided eye contact. Then I spoke. I laid out the timeline calmly. The original letter. The lack of warnings. The post-dated photos. The selective enforcement language buried in meeting summaries. I didn't accuse. I simply asked for explanations. Silence answered first. Then frustration. Then anger, not from homeowners, but from the board. The president finally snapped and said the board had discretionary authority to act in the community's best interest. That sentence changed everything. My attorney, seated quietly in the back, stood and asked her to repeat it. She did. Slowly this time. He nodded, wrote something down, and sat back. That night, several board members resigned. Emails followed the next day, one after another. Apologies. Clarifications. Promises to review procedures. Then came the message no one expected. All outstanding fines were being temporarily suspended pending an internal audit. Including mine. Relief washed over the neighborhood, but it didn't reach me. Suspension wasn't justice. It was damage control. They weren't fixing the problem. They were trying to survive it. As I looked at the original fine letter again, now wrinkled and worn, I realized something important. This fight was no longer about money. It was about accountability. And the truth they were afraid of hadn't even fully surfaced yet. The word audit sounded reassuring to most homeowners, but I knew better. Audits only mattered if they were honest, and the HOA had already shown how flexible it could be with the truth. Still, the announcement shifted power. The board was no longer in control of the narrative. Everyone was watching now. An outside accounting firm was hired, though no one could say who approved the expense or why that specific firm was chosen. Transparency requests were met with polite deflections. The board insisted the process needed space to function. That phrase alone told me everything. They wanted time. Time to rearrange records. Time to clean up stories. Time to limit damage. I requested access to the audit scope and was denied. Instead, I received an email reminding homeowners that interfering with HOA operations could result in penalties. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so revealing. Even cornered, they still reached for threats. Meanwhile, the community stayed restless. People gathered in small groups, whispering on sidewalks and porches. Neighbors who had never spoken beyond polite waves were now comparing letters and dates. Patterns emerged quickly. Entire streets had been targeted in waves. Fines spiked before budget shortfalls. Enforcement cooled off once money came in. Then something unexpected happened. The management company quietly terminated its contract with the HOA. No announcement. No explanation. Just a brief notice stating services would conclude at the end of the month. That single move spoke louder than any apology. Management companies didn't walk away from stable associations. They left sinking ships. A week later, the auditor requested interviews with select homeowners. I was one of them. Sitting across from a woman with a legal pad and sharp eyes, I explained everything again, this time backed by documents, timelines, and neighbor statements. She asked precise questions. She took careful notes. When I finished, she closed her notebook and said, "This isn't an isolated issue." Those words stayed with me. That evening, I received a call from a former board member who had resigned quietly. His voice shook as he spoke. He admitted that fines had been used intentionally to plug budget gaps after poor financial decisions. He said concerns were raised internally but dismissed. He didn't want to be involved anymore. Before hanging up, he sent me emails he had saved, messages that should never have existed. As I read through them, one thing became painfully clear. The HOA hadn't just crossed lines. They had documented it themselves. And once the audit report came out, no amount of silence would protect them. The audit report wasn't released quietly. It couldn't be. By the time it was finished, too many eyes were watching, and too many homeowners were demanding answers. The board scheduled a mandatory community meeting and distributed a brief summary that avoided specifics. That alone set off alarms. Real transparency didn't come with summaries. It came with details. The meeting was held in the largest space available, yet people still stood along the walls. The auditor spoke first, choosing her words carefully but firmly. She confirmed what many suspected. Fines had been issued without proper documentation. Warnings were skipped. Evidence was created after penalties were approved. Funds collected from fines were used to cover operational shortfalls unrelated to enforcement. The room erupted. Homeowners shouted questions. Some demanded refunds. Others wanted resignations. A few sat silently, faces pale, realizing how close they'd come to losing their homes over manufactured violations. The board president tried to regain control, but her voice was drowned out by frustration she could no longer manage. Then the auditor delivered the sentence that changed everything. She stated that the HOA's practices exposed the association to legal liability and potential civil action. That was the moment fear shifted direction. It was no longer homeowners who felt threatened. It was the board. A motion was called to suspend the current board pending investigation. Hands shot up across the room. The vote passed overwhelmingly. Just like that, the people who had controlled the neighborhood for years were stripped of authority in a matter of minutes. In the chaos that followed, I felt an unexpected weight lift from my chest. Not relief. Validation. I hadn't imagined any of it. I hadn't overreacted. The truth was now undeniable, and it belonged to everyone. Within days, notices were sent confirming that all fines issued during the audit period were officially voided. Refunds would be processed. Liens were lifted. Legal threats were rescinded. The $5,000 that had once felt like a looming disaster was now meaningless. But the story didn't end there. Local attorneys began contacting homeowners. A class action was discussed openly. Regulatory agencies were notified. The HOA's insurance provider launched its own review. Consequences multiplied quickly once accountability entered the room. One evening, as I walked through the neighborhood, neighbors waved, stopped to talk, thanked me. Not because I was special, but because someone had finally refused to stay quiet. Systems like this only worked when fear did the enforcing. As I reached my driveway, I looked at my house differently. It wasn't just a place I lived. It was something I had defended. And the ending everyone expected still wasn't the one that was coming. With the board suspended and fines voided, most people assumed the worst was over. On the surface, things looked calmer. Meetings were shorter. Emails were cautious. A temporary oversight committee was installed to keep basic operations running. But underneath that calm sat something far more dangerous for the former board. Accountability doesn't fade quietly. It compounds. The first sign came in the mail. Certified letters addressed not to the HOA, but to individual former board members. Legal notices. Requests for records. Demands for explanations tied to personal decisions, not collective policy. The association's insurance provider made it clear they would not automatically cover actions taken in bad faith. That distinction terrified people who had once hidden behind titles. Then refunds started arriving. Checks appeared in mailboxes across the neighborhood, some for hundreds, others for thousands. With each envelope opened, anger resurfaced. People realized how much had been taken from them under threat. Conversations shifted from relief to resolve. This wasn't just about getting money back. It was about consequences. The temporary committee held an open forum, inviting homeowners to speak freely. Story after story poured out. Retirees who had paid fines to avoid stress. Single parents who had borrowed money out of fear. Families who had postponed repairs, vacations, even medical care to satisfy the HOA. The emotional cost dwarfed the financial one. Behind the scenes, investigations deepened. The emails I'd been sent by the former board member became central evidence. They showed intentional targeting, budget manipulation, and casual discussions about pressure tactics. Words that once felt abstract now carried legal weight. Subpoenas followed. Phones rang unanswered. One afternoon, a reporter showed up. A local news station had received tips about HOA abuse of power. They wanted interviews. They wanted documents. They wanted names. I watched from my porch as a camera crew filmed the entrance sign of our neighborhood, once a symbol of order, now a marker of scandal. When the segment aired, it spread fast. Comments flooded in from people across the city sharing similar stories. It became clear this wasn't isolated. It was a system that thrived on silence. That night, I sat quietly, thinking about how a single letter demanding $5,000 had exposed something much bigger. The former board had tried to scare one homeowner into compliance. Instead, they had triggered a reckoning that reached far beyond our street. And the final chapter of the story would make sure it never happened again. The final outcome didn't come from a courtroom or a dramatic verdict. It came quietly, in writing, delivered the same way this all began. Another letter. Another envelope. But this time, it carried something entirely different. Accountability. The state regulatory agency completed its review and issued formal findings against the former HOA board. Their conclusion was blunt. The board had abused its authority, violated enforcement procedures, and acted in bad faith. As a result, the HOA was placed under mandatory external oversight for 3 years. The former board members were permanently barred from holding HOA leadership positions again. That alone would have been satisfying. But it wasn't the part that shocked everyone. The report also ruled that homeowners directly targeted by selective enforcement were entitled to compensation beyond refunds. Not just returned fines, but damages. Legal costs. Emotional distress. Lost opportunities. The association's reserve fund was tapped to cover settlements, and special assessments were forbidden to replace it. The money had to come from insurance claims and personal liability coverage held by former board members. Suddenly, the people who once issued threats were receiving them. One by one, former board members reached out privately. Some apologized. Others tried to justify their actions as protecting property values. A few asked if I would speak on their behalf. I declined. This wasn't personal anymore. It was precedent. A new board was elected under supervision, made up of people who had once been fined, ignored, or silenced. Their first act wasn't about rules. It was about transparency. Every financial record was published. Every enforcement action required documented warnings. Every meeting was recorded and archived. The neighborhood changed. People stayed after meetings to talk. Committees formed voluntarily. Trust, once broken, began to rebuild slowly, carefully. The HOA became what it was always supposed to be. A service. Not a weapon. One evening, I found the original fine letter while cleaning out a drawer. $5,000. Due immediately. Threatening language. Empty authority. I almost threw it away, then stopped. I folded it and put it back. Because that letter reminded me of something important. Power doesn't disappear when it's challenged. It moves. And when ordinary people refuse to be intimidated, systems that rely on fear collapse under their own weight. The HOA tried to charge me $5,000 to make me compliant. Instead, they exposed themselves, lost everything they controlled, and changed how an entire community operated forever. That was the ending no one saw coming.